quorum so we can have our opening remarks now. Today, we're meeting to consider the nominations of Dean Sauer to serve as Solicitor General, Harmeet Dhillon to serve as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and Aaron Reitz to serve as Assistant Attorney General, Office of Legal Policy. Each of these nominees is highly qualified for their positions. I spoke about their qualifications at the hearing, and so I'm not going to repeat those today. I think the President made good choices for these positions, and obviously I'm going to support them. I would like to address an issue that was raised during my hearing and the week afterwards. My Democratic colleagues and the liberal media kept suggesting that President Trump and his attorneys won't follow court orders. I'd like to review facts on this subject with you. In the few weeks since he's been in office, President Trump has been overwhelmed by decisions from individual district judges that encroach on core constitutional powers. Nevertheless, he and his administration have worked diligently to abide by those orders, no matter how outrageous, by appealing them and challenging their scope and reach. And the President has been explicit in his views because this is what he said, quote, "I always abide by the courts, always abide by them, and we will appeal," end of quote. At their hearing, my colleagues badgered the nominees with hypotheticals, criticizing Mr. Reitz for saying there's no, quote, "hard and fast rule," end quote, in determining the scope of a lawful court order and applicability of court orders to non-parties. As Mr. Reitz explained in his testimony, his response was about, quote, "the role of the courts and their ability to bind parties that are not litigants to the case," end of quote. And another attorney who makes this exact same argument was President Biden's Solicitor General, Elizabeth Prelogar, who wrote, quote, "a court of equity may grant relief only to the parties before it," end of quote. I didn't hear any comments about a constitutional crisis when President Biden's attorneys made the same point that Mr. Reitz did. The nominees expressed a legal argument, a correct one in my view, that judicial decisions are limited to the parties before them and that there are limits to the court's jurisdiction. I think we all agree that parties, including the President, are generally bound by federal court orders, but surely my colleagues aren't taking the extreme position that our system of checks and balances allows for no room to challenge the scope of the rulings or the ones that encroach on constitutional rights or separation of power. Our history teaches that in extreme cases, there may even be grounds to defy a court decision. Think about Dred Scott as an example. President Lincoln defied the Supreme Court by issuing passports and patents to Black Americans. Federal courts have also issued direct orders to federal marshals ordering the return of fugitive slaves. If an official refused to follow that order, I would call that justice and a feature of our system of checks and balances. I'm sure my colleagues would agree, which shows that this issue isn't as binary as they suggest. All three of our nominations should be supported. I also want to take a moment to update my colleagues about my investigative work. Last Congress, I opened an investigation into the Obama-Biden administration obstruction of FBI efforts against Iran's weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs. That investigation was based in a large part on whistleblower disclosures. On Tuesday last week, I released a committee report with my results. My report highlights the following. Then Secretary Kerry prevented the FBI from arresting known Iranian terrorists. And so you can ask the question, why? Because he thought it would interfere with the Biden Obama-Biden-Iran nuclear deal. Records show that as arrest opportunities passed, one FBI official wrote, quote, "We're all besides ourselves on asking the question to stand down on a layup arrest. However, as it stands right now, we'll have to sit back and wait until all the U.S. and Iran negotiations resolve themselves," end of quote. Whistleblowers told my office, quote, "The State Department and Obama-Biden administration officials persistently and systemically derail criminal and national security investigations," end of quote. An email from Shell Oil Company to FBI said that Trump 2016 election win negatively impacted their ability to do business in Iran. Shell told the FBI, quote, "We were in talks with a Japanese bank to handle the funds, but they recently backed off, unofficially citing the coming Trump presidency. European banks feeling the same way," end of quote. It wasn't until Trump took office that the FBI returned to normal law enforcement activities against Iran. My colleagues have complained that the Trump administration has upended the FBI. These records show that the Obama-Biden administration was the one that did that. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a recent editorial about my report titled, quote, "Barack Obama, John Kerry's work for Iran shows Russiagate was pure projection," end of quote. The editorial concludes, quote, "For years, America endured screeches and screams from the left about Donald Trump's servitude to foreign powers. Turns out Democrats were simply projecting," end of quote. It's no secret that I've been one of the loudest critics of the FBI, but credit has to be given when it is due. In the face of failed DOJ and FBI leadership, my report shows FBI line agents made the right effort. For this senator, to those agents, I say thank you. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Chairman Grassley. Let me address the issue which you raised in your opening remarks, because I think it is a critical issue before this Congress, and one which we have not settled within this committee as we should have. You will recall, of course, that when these three nominees were before this committee, a number of us asked pointedly whether they believed that a public official was bound to follow an order of the court. And I was surprised, maybe even shocked a little, that they didn't say unequivocally yes. This morning, again, a question has been raised by the chairman as to what the appropriate answer is. We've had members of the committee opine on this subject. I think we ought to dwell on it at least for a moment, and because of its gravity. This question gets to the very heart of our constitutional democracy. If the Article 3 courts cannot expect their orders to be followed by an executive, then virtually there is no check or balance on that executive's decision-making. And I think I have to say the person I thought spoke with clarity on this issue was Senator Kennedy on the Republican side from Louisiana. And he said, don't ever take the position that you're not going to follow the order of a federal court, ever. He said, you can criticize it, you can appeal it, or you can resign. I think that comment by him spelled out my opinion as well, that anyone who questions an order of the court has limited opportunity to do it in a legal fashion and a constitutional fashion. It's often noted that when Joe Biden, as president, came up with a program to forgive student loans, the court rejected it. He said he disagreed with that court decision and he took another approach. At no time was he found in contempt of the court for their earlier decision or anything that he did subsequently. Now, we've gone back in history to find some pretty terrible decisions by the court. Some of the worst have been noted even this morning, the Dred Scott decision being one of them. And the notion that because it was so inherently wrong, that it didn't have to be followed. I don't believe that that was the lesson of Dred Scott. I believe the lesson was stated clearly by Senator Kennedy and his interpretation of this issue, which is before us. And I would just say that it raises a question in my mind. What if someone said Brown versus Board of Education, calling for the integration of America's public schools, is morally reprehensible to me, and I'm not going to follow it? Well, if you take that position and try as an elected official to hold to it, you will be held personally responsible for a decision in contradiction of the court. I also say that I'm sorry that what I offered on the floor was not accepted. To say that you only have to follow a lawful court order is to engage in the most circular semantics possible. Marbury versus Madison made it clear that the courts decide what the law is. That has been the standing premise since that 1803 decision. And now to say you only have to follow a lawful court order, who decides whether it's lawful? Marbury said the courts decide. Is someone suggesting there's someone else who decides what's lawful? If so, if it happens to be the executive branch, you've just defeated the purpose of judicial review and the rule of law. I don't think this is a minor issue. I think this issue goes to the heart of our Constitution and checks and balances, and I believe it's legitimate to raise it with the nominees of either party because it is so fundamental. Let me add as follows on a different topic. It was just over a month ago that we confirmed Attorney General Pam Bondi. It's been only 3 weeks since we confirmed Kash Patel with the FBI. In that time, Bondi and Patel have plowed through many of the guardrails that protect us from the Justice Department and FBI's vast investigative and prosecutorial authority being used as weapons against the American people. During her confirmation hearing, Ms. Bondi said, and I quote, "I believe that the Justice Department must be independent and must act independently." And then she said, "Politics will not play a part." Now that she's been confirmed, we're hearing something different. Last week in an interview on Fox television with Sean Hannity, the Attorney General said, and I quote, "We are still trying to find a lot of people in the FBI and also in the Department of Justice who despise Donald Trump, despise us. We're going to root them out. We will find them and they will no longer be employed," end of quote. That does not sound like a declaration of independence and apolitical conduct from the Justice Department. During our confirmation hearing, Attorney General Bondi was asked about potential conflicts of interest with her many wealthy lobbying clients, including Amazon, Pfizer, the private prison company Geo Group, and the governor of Qatar. The Attorney General pledged under oath to us, and I quote, "to consult with career ethics officials within the department." We know what happened next. Senator Schiff has raised this issue. Trump officials replaced the Justice Department's long-standing senior career ethics officials with two inexperienced political appointees. This is a dramatic departure from practice under previous administrations, including the first Trump administration. Just last week, in his first day on the job, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche destroyed 2 additional guardrails. He removed the senior career officials who headed the Office of Professional Responsibility and the Office of Pardon Attorney. It's not hard to imagine how corrupting these changes will be. Political appointees now have sole discretion making responsibility on matters relating to ethics, employee discipline, and whistleblower complaints, among other things. Now the Attorney General doesn't want to recuse herself from deciding whether to grant a contract to detain immigrants to her former client, Geo Group. She just needs to check with a political appointee who reports to her. And if Todd Blanche does not want to recuse himself from a decision regarding his former client, President Trump, he just needs to check with the political appointee who reports to him. If Attorney General Bondi wants to fire prosecutors because they won't participate in a corrupt bargain like dismissing charges against New York Mayor Eric Adams in exchange for his political cooperation, she just needs to check with a political appointee who reports to her. If she wants to kill an ethics investigation into her conduct or any other political appointee, she just needs to ask whoever she taps to head up the Office of Professional Responsibility. During his confirmation hearing, Kash Patel claimed that he didn't know anything about the purge of senior career FBI officials. He promised, if confirmed, and I quote, to honor the internal review process of the FBI before removing additional officials. Of course, we now know from highly credible sources that Mr. Patel was personally directing the removal of some of these senior officials as a private citizen. Since he was confirmed, Mr. Patel has continued the purge. He has installed political loyalists in numerous critical positions, including, for the first time in history, a deputy director who is a political appointee, MAGA podcaster Dan Bongino, serving as general counsel, head of congressional affairs, and head of public affairs. And my staff also learned that Patel is slashing staffing for FBI offices with critical expertise and responsibility, including the Civil Rights Unit and the Public Corruption Unit. I commend to my colleagues the floor statement made by Senator Chris Murphy on this issue of corruption. I think it was well worth everyone taking a look at. Keep in mind, in the FBI's long history, this has never happened before. Never. The FBI historically has had only one political appointee, the director. Now Kash Patel is politicizing the ranks of the FBI to go after President Trump's enemies. Remember, Trump himself has said, "I have the absolute right to do what I want with the Justice Department." He's promised to seek retribution against, quote, "the enemy within," close quote. Just as important, the leadership and experience vacuum created by this purge has weakened the Justice Department and the FBI. Trump appointees have removed dozens of senior career civil servants at those departments, including longtime nonpartisan leaders of our counterterrorism and counter-espionage effort. These career civil servants are responsible for coordinating the Justice Department and FBI's fight against terrorism. I hope I'm wrong, but I fear that our nation will pay a price sooner rather than later for these decisions. I yield.
Okay. I would like to move to the nominees now.
May I say something before we do, Chairman?
Proceed.
I want to raise to all of my colleagues an issue that I have with what's happening over at the DOJ and the FBI, and it relates to these two nominees because of my view that the two lead nominees here are essentially Trump operatives who will be far more loyal to Trump personally and to the political movement that Trump leads and to Trump donors than they will to the Constitution or the institutions that they will serve. We've heard a lot about weaponization of the Department of Justice and of other prosecutive efforts, but if you actually look at the trail of those, they went through proper procedures, they went through grand juries, they reached jury determinations in some cases. There's no indication that they're actually violating the traditions and the guardrails of a prosecution. So now, let me just tell you about one thing. I've been looking into this in my role as the ranking member on the Environment and Public Works Committee. There is a fund that was set up under the Biden administration. It was put in place in the summer, well before the election. It involved putting a substantial fund into the hands of Citibank as the fiscal agent to administer the distribution of funds to the program grantees. It was not a midnight deal where this was suddenly, shoved out in the waning hours of the Biden administration as a new administration came in. This was done through regular order, and now the fund is sitting out there. Ed Martin is the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. Before he became the U.S. Attorney, he critiqued politically that fund. He attacked politically that fund. Then he comes in as U.S. Attorney, and here's what happens. The first thing that happens is that because there's no remaining claim against that fund, unless you can hypothesize that there is a crime that has gone on and that you can therefore freeze the fund while you're continuing the investigation of the crime, they tried to create an imaginary crime.
Yeah.
And they asked the grand jury to take a look at this, to open a grand jury investigation. The lead career chief of the criminal division said, no, there's no crime here. There's no predication for a grand jury investigation. I won't do that. They tried to get her to sign a seizure letter, a freeze letter, which would be what you would get once you had a grand jury investigation in place. And she said not only no to the grand jury investigation, she said no to the freeze letter. And I asked unanimous consent that her letter about this be put into the record so everybody has a chance to see it here.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. It is extraordinarily unusual for that to happen. And the result of it was that she was fired. Not that they said, okay, you're right. No, she was fired so that somebody more complacent could be put in her place. So they evidently shopped this effort around the U.S. Attorney's Office, and nobody would sign it. So the U.S. Attorney went forward on his own. I've been a U.S. Attorney. It is extremely unusual for a U.S. Attorney to proceed in his own or her own name. Your name is on the pleadings, but the actual AUSA who's doing the work is usually the person who is the moving individual and whose name is signed on the pleadings. Your name is on it, but you're not the party, the individual going forward. He went forward individually. That is wildly unusual. And what's even more unusual is the guy's not even a federal prosecutor. He has no experience. It wasn't like he had some rare and special expertise that the office didn't have, so he would go forward on his own. So you've got a fired person, you've got shopping it around unsuccessfully, you've got the political U.S. attorney going after this fake criminal investigation to get access to a freeze of the fund that he previously criticized as a political civilian. And it gets better still from there, because when he went forward seeking the order from the magistrate judge said no. Magistrate judges almost never say no to those kind of pleadings from U.S. attorneys' offices, because no U.S. attorney's office wants to put a magistrate judge in a position where they have to say no. You double and triple check, you backstop, you do not present something like that to a judge until you have it nailed down. And in my office, if we had pursued a warrant or seizure application and a judge had said no, there would be a significant follow-up internally about what the hell went wrong, because you never, never, never want to put a magistrate judge in the position where they have to say no to something that we have asked for. It's a failure of preparation at best. So now, in addition, you've got the improper effort to pursue the fake crime. You force out the person who said, no, there's no crime here. You try to shop it around the office and nobody else will sign. You then have the weirdness of the U.S. attorney proceeding essentially solo with no record of experience as a federal prosecutor, so he's clearly just flailing about. He goes before the magistrate judge says no, and it still doesn't end. Then reportedly, the Department of Justice starts shopping it to other U.S. attorneys' offices. They'd completely blown up in this office. They had a bad ruling from a judge, and they keep shopping it to try to find other U.S. attorneys' offices. And apparently, nobody would do it. There's still no order out there. But Kash Patel's FBI agents are now running around asking people questions. I hear it's under the authority of a U.S. attorney's office in Florida. The parties involved are the EPA, Washington, D.C., Citibank, headquartered in New York. If they had to shop it all the way down the East Coast to Florida to find a U.S. attorney's office that was willing to turn FBI agents loose, again, that's a sign of things gone badly, badly awry from proper Department of Justice procedure. And when you begin with the U.S. attorney saying, I don't like this fund, I want to go after this fund isn't proper, before he even gets in office, not a prosecutor, starts bumbling around and wrecking things trying to get this done. You know, this is a trail of misuse and abuse of the criminal justice system, whose purpose is to create the illusion of criminal activity so they can freeze a fund that has already been appropriated and obligated and has been sitting out there since last summer for people who have made real commitments based on the grants that they were expecting. You know, there's a bus company we heard from yesterday. They've ordered parts for the new buses that were going to be bought. They have a supply chain people who are depending on them. They are having to deal with refinancing the company because the pledged money is not coming through. This whole thing completely stinks to high heaven, and I would like to, for the sake of this committee, I want to put my letter to the Attorney General and to Kash Patel into the record. This was done out of the Environment Public Works Committee, so you may not have seen it yet, but this explains what has gone wrong. If you want to find weaponization of the Department of Justice, look no further than this. Guardrail after guardrail after guardrail broken.
Without objection.
And I thank you for allowing me the time, Mr. Chairman. This is important to me. It covers two of my committees. And as a former U.S. attorney, I can tell you every single one of these is a really sickening warning sign, and there are multiple warning signs.
Before I call on Senator Coons, are we going to be able to get our members here so we can vote? Okay. In regard to what I just said to Republican staff, our members are supposed to be here by a certain time, and I hope that's well before 10:30. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to follow up on one of the points just made by my colleague. Since the inauguration of President Trump, my colleagues and I have sent 5 oversight letters to the Department of Justice and the FBI. A letter to DOJ asking to review the Jack Smith report, no response. A letter to DOJ and FBI about the purge of FBI agents, no response. A letter to Attorney General Bondi asking the DOJ retain Eric Adams' case records, no response. A letter to AG Bondi about the reassignment of career DOJ and FBI employees, no response. Mr. Chairman, I've long respected your dogged pursuit of responses to your DOJ oversight letters. I hope you will help my colleagues and I get responses to our letters. I also look forward to this committee beginning oversight hearings. In the first months of the Biden administration, then Chairman Durbin scheduled an FBI oversight hearing for March 2021 and a Bureau of Prisons oversight hearing for April of 2021. We should be conducting hearings on the same timeline during this administration. I want to speak to these 3 nominees briefly, if I could. At a time when DOJ independence from the White House is critical, given everything that's just been discussed by my colleague from Rhode Island, President Trump has sent us a slate of nominees on our agenda today that I cannot trust to stand up for the Constitution and the rule of law. 2 of today's nominees are quite literally on Trump's payroll. John Sauer is still representing Trump in the Second Circuit. Harmeet Dhillon earned millions over the last 2 years from representing Trump and his campaign and is representing him as a private attorney right now. These are the people we expect to pursue justice for all Americans rather than the demands of a client who has been paying them for years. Those checks don't come because nominees Sauer and Dhillon tell Trump no. They come because they tell him yes. And Aaron Reitz, he refused to say the Trump administration needs to abide by court orders. In my view, his answer was disqualifying on its own. But I want to briefly highlight his response to one of my questions for the record. I asked him in writing, what is the remedy if the president violates his constitutional duty to faithfully execute the law? This is not a hard question or an unprecedented one. Attorney General Bondi got it right. She said a plaintiff could take the president to court. Mr. Sauer got it right. He said Congress could impeach. But Reitz didn't choose either of those appropriate answers. He said regularly scheduled presidential elections. Just think about that for a moment. The person who wants to help run the Department of Justice says there is no justice to be done when the president refuses to follow the law. According to Reitz, if the president acts lawlessly, the only option is to sit here and take it for 4 years, hoping the next election will bring some relief. Now, I'm not naive. I know my colleagues are going to vote to confirm these nominees. That means the oversight of DOJ is all the more important. Thus, my concern about making sure that our letters get a response and that this committee holds oversight hearings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator from Hawaii.
Thank you very much. All 3 of the nominees before us present major concerns about whether or not they ought to be confirmed, and obviously I do not think they ought to be confirmed. I would like to focus on Ms. Dhillon. She is nominated to be the lead of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. This is the division that is supposed to be protecting our right to vote. What could be more important than our citizens' right to vote? The Civil Rights Division was established by the Civil Rights Act of 1957, specifically designed to protect the right to vote and to prevent states from interfering with voting rights. Remember, there was a time when people couldn't vote in this country. Blacks were told you have to count how many beans are in a jar before they could vote. It was just horrifying, the barriers that were placed in front of people's right to vote. So we passed the Civil Rights Division. Then, after the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County, some 13 states immediately began to pass legislation. Well, the Shelby County decision basically eviscerated the Voting Rights Act. Some 13 states immediately began to pass legislation that would make it harder for people to vote. That is why we have the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office. Ms. Dhillon is not the person that's going to enforce our right to vote laws. In fact, quite the contrary. So, she is just yet another example of someone who's placed in a position of leadership and responsibility to do something that they have no intention of doing. It raises severe concerns for me because an individual's right to vote is, in my view, one of the most important rights that we need to protect. I urge my colleagues to vote against this nominee, as well as the other two before
Senator
us.
Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by setting the backdrop for the nominees we're considering today. And the backdrop is the creation of a narrative around the weaponization of the Department of Justice. The reason for this narrative is the need by the president to explain why he's the first president in history to be indicted multiple times. The most significant indictment, of course, was the president's role in the January 6th insurrection. The subsequent indictment or the additional indictment on the sequestering of boxes of classified documents in Mar-a-Lago, the obstruction of that investigation, cumulatively require the president to have an explanation for why he's the first president in history to be multiply indicted. And not just the fact of the indictment, but the fact that multiple grand juries reviewing the evidence found probable cause to believe the President of the United States had committed many, many crimes. In order to explain that, the President has to create this narrative that the Justice Department was somehow improperly weaponized against him. Because he's the only president in history to be indicted multiple times. What other explanation could there be? Well, sometimes the simplest explanation is the most accurate, and the simple explanation here is he's the first president to commit these crimes while in office. And nevertheless, this narrative that has been created around the weaponization of the department, the fact that the department, far from weaponizing the use of justice, chose to treat the president like any other American, neither better nor worse. That is, they didn't give him immunity to violate the criminal laws. Had they decided that they would indict the people who attacked the Capitol and beat police officers, the people who conspired to make it happen, but give a pass to the one who incited it, had they decided that if other employees in the intelligence community elsewhere brought boxes of classified documents home, that they would be prosecuted, but if a president did it, they would be treated differently. It would have meant the renunciation of the whole idea that no one is above the law. So they followed the law, and the law led to Donald Trump. But this narrative they have created also serves another purpose, and that is it allows them in Orwellian fashion to do what they have accused others of doing, but have accused falsely, and that is it allows them to weaponize the department, to use the department as a sword and as a shield. Now, as Sheldon Whitehouse has so ably described, they're using it as a sword to try to create criminal cases where none exist, as a predicate to, in the case of this environmental fund, to try to shut it down, to go after it. Where there is no probable cause, they ask multiple prosecutors and multiple magistrates to open an investigation, and finding no probable cause, they did their ethical duty and said, no, it simply doesn't exist. And so they're fired, and the case is shopped from prosecutor to prosecutor to prosecutor, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, in an effort to use the department as a sword, to go after either programs the president doesn't like or political enemies. We have seen letters go out from the DC, the acting US attorney in DC, to Democratic members of Congress intended to chill their speech, intended to use the department as yet another vehicle of the president's power. But of course, they're not just using it as a sword, as a sword, but they're also using it as a shield. And here we see that on graphic display in New York, where the Justice Department has intervened in a serious criminal case involving the mayor of New York, a corruption case, a bribery case, and moved to dismiss it. And why? Because the mayor is useful. He's useful to them in an unrelated policy matter, and that is immigration. So they moved to dismiss the case, and not just dismiss it, but dismiss it without prejudice, meaning they want to keep that case hanging over his head like a sword of Damocles, that should the mayor stop doing the president's bidding, they will let it drop. Is this where we are now, where the Justice Department can be so blatantly used as a mode of intimidation, as a mode of control, as a mode of making policy? Now, what has empowered all of this is a decision by the Supreme Court that gives a president immunity from criminal liability, but most particularly says in certain core areas of responsibility, the immunity is absolute. And here the Supreme Court of the United States said that when the president uses the Justice Department, he is absolutely immune. There could be no more frontal assault on the post-Watergate policy of having some division between the White House and the Justice Department than the Supreme Court of the United States saying, break down that wall, use the department any way you wish, create cases where there's no evidence, dismiss cases where there's plenty of evidence, and you will never face accountability. No matter how corrupt the motive, you will never face accountability. You could pay the president of the United States to drop a case against the foreign national. You could pay him directly, you could buy his meme coin, you could do whatever you want, and he would be immune from criminal liability under the Supreme Court's decision. This has turbocharged the ability to weaponize the Department of Justice by a president who wishes to use it for that purpose. Now we enter these nominees and others before them as the instruments of that ability to use the department. The first three top appointments all go to the president's criminal defense lawyers. Pam Bondi, who represented him, Todd Blanche, who represented him, John Sauer, who represented him, many who still represent him, many who cannot distinguish between representing him personally and representing the United States of America. I asked Mr. Sauer about his ethical obligations. I asked Mr. Blanche the same. These were two, at the time of their questioning, current lawyers for the president. Well, when they're the former lawyers for the president, they still have a continuing ethical obligation to their former client, not to injure the interests of the former client. That would demand recusal, but none were willing to commit. The most they would be willing to do is say that they will consult with the career ethics lawyers at the Department of Justice, but they're gone. They're now fellow criminal defense lawyers of Donald Trump. The inspector generals are gone. The head of the Office of Professional Responsibility gone. The career national security professionals gone. Lawyers who won't bring cases where there's no evidence, gone. Lawyers who won't dismiss cases where there's plenty of evidence, gone. And what is taking their place but people who don't understand where the representation of the person of the president ends and the representation of the country should begin. And I would just say that for any of us that might think that we are immune because of our positions in this body or any other, the longer we allow this to go on, the more we confirm people who will not recuse themselves, the more we expose ourselves and our very democracy to a president with no respect for the rule of law, empowered by a Supreme Court that has given him no reason to fear the law. And I can't tell you where that will lead, but I can tell you it will lead to a place that will not look like a democracy. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Senator Durbin, then I think
Mr.
we'll have
Chairman.
members here and we can vote.
Mr. Chairman.
Who's calling? Senator Blumenthal. Go ahead, Senator Blumenthal.
Yeah, I will be very quick on a point that I hope will unite us on this committee. Simply to add to the backdrop that Senator Schiff has outlined so well, the action against law firms because of who their clients are should be chilling to every one of us on this committee. Literally, there is nothing more fundamental, and I say it as one who has been a prosecutor, has gone after some really bad, disgusting people who are entitled to be represented. If the Department of Justice is taking action against law firms, whether it is Perkins Coie or any other law firm, simply because they represented someone who is a political adversary of the president, we are in deep trouble. And I know for the broad public, this issue may seem esoteric. Lawyers are not the most popular of professions in this country, necessarily. But we know on this committee how fundamental it is for people to be represented. And this is chilling, as the judge said yesterday. She said it sent a chill down her spine that Perkins Coie was, in essence, being put out of business. A major law firm, reputable, distinguished for its past performance, just like Covington and Burling, which also was a target. And I would just ask my fellow members of this committee to join me. I am going to be writing and espousing this cause because I think it should bring us together in a bipartisan way. It isn't directly related necessarily to these nominees, but they will be responsible for administering a Justice Department that is undermining justice when it attacks lawyers simply because they have represented adversaries of the President of the United States.
Senator Durbin.
I want to join in Senator Blumenthal's remarks. I'll be happy to join in your letter as well. Our first nominee is going to be John Sauer, who is aspiring to the role of Solicitor General. It's a critical role in representing the United States before the Supreme Court. Traditionally, an apolitical appellate lawyer, Mr. Sauer, unfortunately, does not fit the mold. In the most troubling moment of his confirmation hearing, Mr. Sauer suggested that court orders need not always be followed. This is a shocking position from someone who aspires to be the so-called 10th Justice, as the Solicitor General is known. There was high praise for Mr. Sauer's legal ability from at least two members of this panel, the senators from Missouri, both of whom were attorneys general of that state and worked with him. That's why it came as a surprise when the simple, direct question as to whether a public official must follow a court order was equivocated by Mr. Sauer. I aspire to the Kennedy standard, Senator Kennedy on this panel, who established what I think is the legitimate standard when it comes to these court orders and whether they need to be followed. And I will oppose his nomination.
Now we'll vote. So the clerk will call the roll on John Sauer.
Mr. Graham.
Aye.
Mr. Cornyn.
Aye.
Mr. Lee.
Aye.
Mr. Cruz.
Aye.
Mr. Hawley.
Aye.
Mr. Tillis.
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy.
Aye.
Mrs. Blackburn.
Aye by proxy.
Mr.
No.
Mr. Coons?
No by proxy?
Mr. Blumenthal?
No.
Ms. Rono?
No.
Mr. Booker?
No by proxy?
Mr. Padilla?
No.
Mr. Welch?
No.
Mr. Schiff?
No.
Chairman Grassley?
Aye.
On this vote, the ayes are 12, the nays are 10.
The nomination will be favorably reported. Now to Mrs. Dhillon.
I'd like to be recognized.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Dhillon is yet another of President Trump's personal attorneys nominated to a senior position at the Justice Department. Her law firm's clients include the president and his campaign, and her firm has received millions of dollars in legal fees from the president's team. During her hearing, she claimed that President Trump had never asked her to do anything objectionable, dismissed the prospect of the president asking her to do something illegal or unconstitutional as hypothetical. We all know this is not a hypothetical. As the head of the Civil Rights Division, Ms. Dhillon will be responsible for protecting access to the ballot by enforcing the voting rights laws. But look at her track record when it comes to protecting elections. Ms. Dhillon repeatedly questioned the outcome and legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election. In November 2020, she tweeted, and I quote, "Stop the steal," close quote, and encouraged her followers to donate to President Trump's election defense fund. The day after the 2020 election, while votes were still being counted, Ms. Dhillon infamously called for the Supreme Court to intervene and declare Trump a winner. She stated, quote, "We're waiting for the United States Supreme Court, of which the president has nominated 3 justices, to step in and do something, and hopefully Amy Coney Barrett will come through." During her hearing, Ms. Dhillon doubled down on her election denialism, repeating her dubious claims about irregularities and so-called voter integrity. She still refuses to admit that President Biden won the 2020 election. But even beyond her concerning ties to President Trump, she has a long history of advocating for restricting civil rights, and now she's responsible for that department if she's approved. She supported voting laws that make it harder to access the ballot. She criticized key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Nothing in her record indicates she'll place the civil rights of American people above the president she serves. I will oppose her.
Call the roll.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make quickly say I'm a little confused. Senator Blumenthal made a statement which I happen to agree with, and then the ranking member agreed with it. Said basically to the effect that you shouldn't hold against a lawyer who their clients are and who they've represented. Yet it seems to me to be the principal argument of our Democratic friends that these individuals are not qualified because of who their client was.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grant?
Aye.
Mr. Cornyn?
Aye.
Mr. Lee?
Aye.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye.
Mr. Hawley? Mr. Tillis?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Schmidt? Mrs. Britt? Mrs. Moody? Mr. Durbin?
No.
Mr. Whitehouse?
No.
Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Coons?
No by proxy.
No by
Mr.
proxy?
Blumenthal?
No.
Ms. Rono? No. Mr. Booker?
No by proxy.
Sorry. Mr. Booker?
No by proxy.
Thank you so much. Mr. Padilla?
No.
Mr. Welch?
No.
Mr. Schiff?
No.
Chairman Grassley?
Aye.
On this vote, the ayes are 12, the nays are 10.
Ms. Dhillon will be reported. Now we have the nomination. You want to speak on this? Yeah, go ahead and speak.
Mr. Chairman, Aaron Reitz has demonstrated he is not fit to serve in any role in the Department of Justice. He believes there are instances in which a public official may defy a court order that should concern every member of this committee on both sides of the table. As Senator Kennedy said to Mr. Reitz during his hearing, quote, "Don't ever take the position you're not going to follow the order of a federal court, ever," close quote. I couldn't agree more. Failing to unequivocally commit to following federal court orders should disqualify any nominee before this committee. This is not only my concern. Mr. Reitz attempted to hide his disturbing views on many issues, deleting approximately 4,000 social media posts. Nothing was off limits in his social media posts that we uncovered. The venom and self-righteousness in his posts are fair warning of what he would bring to the Department of Justice. There was one episode involving the Olympic gymnast Simone Biles. I am not going to go into it because he publicly apologized for what he said, but there are other things of concern. I will only speak of one. Before Derek Chauvin was convicted of murdering George Floyd, Mr. Reitz wrote, and I quote, "No question in my mind," he wrote, "that Chauvin is not guilty." Really? Did he see the 9 minutes and 29-second video of Chauvin kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck as he cried out for his mother? Can you ever forget the look in his eyes? Several Republican members of this committee rightfully spoke out against this heinous crime. After Chauvin was convicted, Mr. Reitz called the jury decision, quote, "a bogus guilty verdict," close quote. Mr. Wright's disrespect for the finality of court orders is matched by his disrespect for the finality of a jury verdict. He's unfit to lead the Office of Legal Policy, and I urge my colleagues to oppose him.
Mr. Chairman,
Who's calling?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, please, go ahead, Senator Cruz.
if I could briefly respond, I will say it is rich listening to our Democrat colleagues profess their fidelity to the rule of law after 4 years of happily turning a blind eye to Joe Biden and the Biden Justice Department ignoring federal law, refusing to force federal immigration law, blatantly defying the law. And ironically, the litany of false charges that the senator from Illinois just directed at Mr. Reitz is really striking, but their favorite talking point is that he will defy federal court orders. Now, he's been a practicing lawyer for many years. He's never defied a federal court order, but I'll tell you who has: Joe Biden. And in fact, let's read what Joe Biden said in his tweet. Here's what Joe Biden said, quote, "The Supreme Court tried to block me from relieving student debt, but they didn't stop me. I've relieved student debt for over 5 million Americans. I'm going to keep going." That's the same Joe Biden they were happy to salute and listen to defy the court if it's in favor of their left-wing political agenda. I will point out the aspersions Ranking Member Durbin just cast to Mr. Reitz. He is also in the Marines as a reserve, a major in the Marines. He has fought to defend this nation, and he will make an exemplary Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice. And I, for one, am glad we are getting officials at the Department of Justice who will follow the damn law instead of being lawless and treating the Department of Justice and FBI as the personal enforcement arm of the Democrat National Committee. I urge everyone to vote yes, although I'm confident everyone on the left side of the aisle is going to vote no, because for all their words of the rule of law, they could not bring themselves once to demand the rule of law be followed from the Biden Justice Department.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Graham.
Aye.
Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mr. Tillis. Aye. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Mr. Schmidt. Aye. Mrs. Britt. Aye. Mrs. Moody. Aye. Mr. Durbin.
No.
Mr. Whitehouse.
No.
Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal.
No.
Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. Booker.
No by proxy.
Mr. Padilla.
No.
Mr. Welch.
No.
Mr. Schiff.
No.
Chairman Grassley.
Aye.
On this vote, the ayes are 12, the nays are 10.
The nomination will be favorably reported. The committee is adjourned.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to be recorded aye in person on Mr. Sauer.
You will be so recorded without objection.